Once you've gone through and you've created your survey and you've got all the different facets of those survey elements built in, so you know what pages you're going to use, what that welcome page is going to look like, how people are going to navigate through the individual pages of the survey, what question and survey parts are going to be on there, how that pipe data is going to look, what response routing options you want to use. Now you're ready to actually go ahead and publish and distribute your survey. And so there's a lot of different options when you start talking about how you're going to work through and distribute your survey. And so over the course of this module, we want to look at just what are the different distribution options. So once that survey is published, what items get populated and what happens when you start distributing that situation. How does it work when you go through and work through anonymous distribution? And what does email distribution look like? And what are the differences? How do you facilitate what that is when you're going through? Also looking through, going through and embedding your survey and talking through some of those options. And we also want to explore some of the alerting functionality. But more importantly, we also want to look at how responses are gathered inside the application when items are going through. From a survey distribution perspective, there's really two baseline options. There's anonymous distribution, and that's very much what it sounds like. Respondents and the people that you're sending that survey to, you don't know who they are. And then there's non-anonymous distribution, which you're going to specify a specific contact or an account or a lead or somebody inside your Dynamics implementation that you want to link that survey to. So what ends up happening is once you publish that survey, you will get two pieces of information. You'll get what's called an email snippet, which will be that personalized link that you can use for non-anonymous distribution. And then you'll get kind of the just generalized anonymous distribution link that you can use. Now, depending upon how you want to distribute that survey, you also have the capabilities to run it in an iframe as well. And we'll show you just a little bit about this as we actually go through and publish the surveys themselves. When you're choosing between anonymous and non-anonymous, realistically, either one works depending upon who your audience is. The only major difference is from an anonymous perspective, you're going to take that URL that shows up in that screen and you're just going to copy and paste it into whatever medium you want. It could be an iframe, it could be just an email that you want to put in. Regardless of what the situation is, it doesn't necessarily matter from that perspective. Now, what's nice about this is as people are going in and clicking on these anonymous links and they're taking this survey, you do have an option with the survey itself, and we saw that a little bit at the overview of the survey, where I could create leads in the system from anonymous responses, where I could try to capture some additional information about that. So even though they're not necessarily tied to somebody inside my organization, I could use that facilitation process to be able to create a lead and then work with the information from there. From a non-anonymous situation, as we've mentioned on the previous slide, every respondent's going to get basically a unique URL that's going to get sent to them. Now that URL is generated whenever what's called the email snippet field is used inside either a survey invitation or embedded in an email. And a survey invitation gets created anytime that a survey invite is sent out or anytime that an email is created. So one of the real common situations that you would see is to embed this URL inside an email, send the email through an email activity to one specific person, and then it will go through and automatically create the survey invitation for you. And we'll show you this when we actually go through and do the demo. But let's look at some of the different distribution capabilities. So what's nice about this is you can see that, here's some of the different options that define what situations you might be using when you're distributing these surveys. So obviously when I'm going to distribute the survey, I do have to publish it before I can send it out. But I can see that if I send it out as an anonymous link, I can really send it out through any type of different media within that situation. Now the only difference with an anonymous survey is I don't have the ability to do piped data. Obviously that survey is not going to be tied to a specific record inside Dynamics 365, so I would be looking at scenarios where I might want to go out and just have kind of a generic situation. As far as what responses I can capture inside Dynamics 365, I can really only create leads from those anonymous responses. Now, from another situation, I do have the ability to email or provide email templates. And so by sending out an email, I can either trigger that email functionality from kind of a workflow. I could trigger that through a campaign or a quick campaign. I could do mail merges, any number of different situations. Now, what's nice about that is when I generate those email situations from an email template standpoint, that can include pipe data. So if I create an email template that's associated with the survey that I want to work through, that template will be used. Pipe data can be fed into that situation, and I can associate it with either a direct email that's sent out based upon that template, or I could use a workflow. If I want to do just a generic email activity, that could be done as well. Now, from a piped perspective, the piped data coming out of that email activity typically works best from a workflow perspective, because I need to define what that specific pipe data is going to be. And we'll show you that here when we come in and do the demo as well. But regardless of how you distribute it, you do have the capabilities from an email perspective to actually have it be, the account field, the contact, the lead, or the regarding record if it's associated with a case or something similar. And then the other option that you have is kind of just to send out invitations, survey invitations only. And these are real helpful if you're using, third-party email providers to facilitate interaction and distribute surveys from there. Then you could go out and have the survey invitations kind of be auto-created. In this case, we're going to focus mainly on kind of the email delivery mechanism around those individual options. I'm back in by my Voice of the Customer solution. Let's look at this publishing and distribution process. So I'm going to go in and I'm just going to publish my survey. And this will take just a little bit and it'll go through and publish it. And you'll notice that it's published because once it's published, the command bar is going to change significantly. There'll be additional options that will kind of pop in there and some different things that you'll see around testing it and previewing it and stopping it and different situations. Now, obviously, this tells us that, this survey does have some pipe data. So just to make sure that we do have all the confidential information in there, we just want to make sure that, we're not piping confidential information into the survey. But when we get into that, we'll talk a little bit about that process. So I'm going to go ahead and switch back to my survey itself. And you'll notice a couple of different things that have changed. So obviously the first thing that's changed is now the status around this item has been set to publish. So I can see that it's a published survey. When I come down into my survey runtime and my invitation actions options, now I can see that I have an anonymous link that was created for this. So this is that item that I could real simply just copy and paste into an email, or somebody just clicks on it and it will open up the survey and allow a respondent to take that survey anonymously. Now that's pretty straightforward as far as from a distribution mechanism and as far as how I would work through that. The other option that I have is this email snippet. So this is the unique email snippet that is associated with this particular survey. Now, if I look up here on my preview or up on my command bar, I can also see that there's an option here to copy snippet. This would give me the ability to copy the information that's in that email snippet and now use that as any type of kind of facilitation process within the application. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and just copy it. And so I'll allow access. Now I'm going to go ahead and in my solution, I'm going to go ahead and just go to sales and I'm going to go to activities. And for this example, we're just going to show you the concepts around what's taking place. I want to do another demo right after this where we're actually truly consuming the pipe data as part of a workflow, but I want to show you just kind of the baseline principle that's taking place first. So in here, I have an activity or I have an item that I want to work with. Now I would have the capabilities to kind of create, a different type of situation in here based upon items that I want to work with. So in this case, I could go ahead and create, any type of activity inside the application. So if I wanted to create, for example, like an email activity, I would have the capabilities to create that email activity. So I'm going to go ahead and click on email. I'm going to specify who, where it's coming from, specify who I want to send it to. And again, this is more just to illustrate the concept. So I'm going to go ahead and select a specific person to send it to. And we'll just call this sample VOC survey. And then we'll paste in my snippet. So this is what the actual snippet is going to look like inside that email. Now, at this point, I could go ahead and just send this email activity and it would show up in the person's email. So I'll go ahead and just hit send here. And you'll notice kind of very quickly once it sends this information, and you'll kind of see it flash here, that all of a sudden I had a situation that said, please complete the survey. Let me just show you kind of another aspect of this. So I'm going to go ahead and sort by due date. Here's my sample survey activity. So the first thing that happened is I just kind of sent this information off, and I've got a situation here that's going to show me kind of my sample survey activity. When I open this option up, it's going to show me kind of the generalized information that was sent out, and then it's also going to show me kind of the invitation link that was associated with this. But this survey activity gets generated once the email is created inside the application. So these are the items that you can see as you're going through, and this shows you kind of all of the individual situations. So I can see the activity itself. Now I'm going to look to see here real quick if I can find the email. So we'll just take a second, I'll grab the email, and then I'll show you what that looks like. So here's that email that I received. So it's come into this particular mailbox. Here's my option to please complete our survey. So I'm going to go ahead and please complete our survey. Now at this point, again, I haven't used pipe data. This was only just to illustrate the concept behind how that process works. So now I would have my option to go ahead and take the survey. I could fill in my information here, and then I could start the survey and work the survey through to completion. Now I'm not going to do that because I want to show you one more option in regards to the pipe data, and we'll show you that here in kind of the next demo. We talked in previous modules about pipe data. We talked about how you can include that pipe data in your survey just by adding those options as you're designing your questions. Once it's time to actually distribute that survey and consume that pipe data, now you have to declare what that pipe data is as parameters inside the distribution method through the invite that you're working with. And so this is actually information that's attached to the GUID of the survey snippet information that's created. Now I'll give you kind of an example here on the screen, and then we'll take in and show you realistically from like a workflow what that process would look like. So if I look at, for example, here I have my survey snippet that has the GUID for the record that I'm working with, and you'll notice right next to the actual GUID for the record it has this bar, which they refer to as a pipe, which is why they call it pipe data. And so now it's defining the customer pipe data. So it's saying that the customer value is going to equal Jim. So in this case, if I were to look at this from a piped survey perspective, once I actually go out and distribute this particular survey, the customer pipe data option is going to be replaced with Jim. And so that's what's going to be presented back into the application. So we talked about the fact that they're name value pairs. That's kind of the big thing to remember here, is for each piped piece of data that you have defined for a specific survey, you have to define what that information looks like. So you have to say customer is going to equal this value, product is going to equal this value, user is going to equal this value. And by defining what those situations are, then it understands that more realistically when it actually distributes that out, and that's what's going to get presented in. Now the nice thing about that is obviously if you were piping this into a regular email, you would have to manually kind of fill out what those options are. Realistically, if you're doing it through a workflow, you can use your dynamic field values inside the workflow to really correspond with how that pipe data is going to be presented. And that's the next thing that I want to hop into the app and show you. Let's look at a real practical example of how all this comes together from a distribution perspective. So if you think about it from how you might be operating your business, particularly if you're a customer service organization that's doing case management for customers, customer's going to open a case, representative is going to work through that case and then ultimately resolve that case. And what we would want to do at that point is we'd want to send them out a survey. And using the pipe data option, we would want to be able to kind of target the information that's in that survey, so when the person's taking it, they get really kind of that personalized experience. And so we're going to take you through that entire process. So the first thing that we would have to do is create a workflow that's going to run whenever a case is resolved. So we're just going to go into settings and we're going to go into processes. And we're going to create a new process. And we're just going to call this like post-case follow-up or post-case close or something like that. In this case, I'll just call this post-case survey. It's going to be a workflow. And it's going to be based off of the case entity because we're going to basically have this happen once we resolve that case. So then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to click on OK. And for purposes of working with it, it works just fine if it's a background workflow. So we'll just kind of leave everything the way they are. But then we'll go ahead and change the scope to organization so it runs anytime anybody in the organization closes a case. We're going to switch our triggering from when a record is created to when a record status changes, because ultimately the case is going to be resolved, and then we want to run through and kind of check this. So I'm now going to go ahead that I've got my individualized information set up, and I'm just going to go ahead and define my conditions. So I'll scroll down here just a little bit so it's a little easier to see. I'm going to add a step, and I'm going to check condition, and we're just going to check case status. Now I'm going to go ahead and configure my condition, and ultimately what I want to know here is the case status resolved? I know that the case status has changed, but has the status of the case been set to be resolved? So we'll go into select, we'll go into case, we'll look at the case status, and we're going to just choose resolved. So if the case is resolved, we want to go ahead and fire off an email. So we'll save and close this. And now we'll go ahead and click here to add a step, and we'll add a step, and we'll just go ahead and send an email. And we'll hit set properties on the email. And we could do it normally if you were working with this from behind the scenes type of situation, you'd probably have a scenario where it's coming from like a system account or something like that. In this case, we're just going to have the email come from the owner of the case. So we'll use our dynamic values. So we'll go into from, and we'll say owning user, and then we'll add that and click on OK to add that to the from. Now we're going to go ahead and decide who we're going to send this to. Well, cases are generally associated with customers, which could be either a contact or an account in the system. So in this case, we'll go ahead and just say that it's going to be sent to the case customer. So we'll hit add and OK. And then what is the subject? So what are we doing with this? So we're going to just call this please complete our post case survey. And then we'll come into the actual text and we'll say, please take a moment to complete our survey. Now, this is where that snippet comes in from an email perspective. So normally when we look at the snippet, it would basically just be the grid of the item. Now I've got one here that's kind of already pre-set up, and I'll show you why we're going to use that particular one. So I'm just going to copy and paste this into my area. So you'll see here that normally when you look at these snippets, it just has the survey snippet start with the grid of the survey and then the end. When you want to use pipe data, as we saw kind of in the previous example, you define what that information is that you want to work with. If you want to dynamically populate that information from a CRM record, this is where you can use those dynamic values. So in here, for example, where I have customer, let me just delete this out of here quick, and where I have user, these are those name value pairs that we want to use. So this is where I'm going to define what I want to pull in. Now normally, I could hard code this if I wanted to, but being that this is a workflow, it would make more sense to dynamically populate this information from the case record. So when it actually opens it up inside the survey itself, we can see kind of a dynamic value associated with that. So in here where it says customer, I'm just going to click after the equal sign and define where I want this information to come from. Well, I want this information to come from the case itself. And so within this situation, if I click on the case, I can see that there's a lot of different options here. And realistically, these cases will have a customer associated with them. That customer could be an account or a contact. In this case, we're going to go ahead and create a case for contacts. So we're going to choose customer contact, and then we're going to just choose the first name of the customer. So we have kind of that personalized experience. And so if we scroll down, we'll see that the first name field is available for us to use in here. We'll go ahead and hit add to bring it in. And then we'll go ahead and click on OK. And that should pop the customer right in and the customer name right in after the customer option within my snippet. Same thing with user. So now for user, I want this to basically default to the user or the person that owns the case. So in this case, I will switch my look for back to case. and then I will switch this to the case owner. Now, I don't necessarily need the first name option anymore in here, so I can remove that. Now I can add case owner, and then I can click on OK. Now in this case, sometimes this happens, it just jumps things around a little bit. That's okay, we'll just remove it here again. We'll try one more time. We'll just position our cursor. We'll click on OK, and it pops it right into that spot for us. So now this is going to dynamically populate the contents of the survey with the information from Dynamics CRM. And the nice thing again about this is the fact that the link itself isn't going to change. That's kind of the reason they have the survey snippet links set up the way that they do. The snippet's going to look just fine. It's still going to have the same link presented in it. So now I can go ahead and save and close this. Now I can come up into my workflow and activate my workflow. I'll confirm activation. Now that I know it's been activated, I can go ahead and close out of here. And now in my application, I'm just going to go into Service and Cases, and we're just going to create a new case for a customer. So I'll go ahead and create a new case. We'll call this Sample Post Case Survey. We'll go into the customer, and we're going to associate this with a customer named Jim Glenn. Now we'll save our case. Now, normally I'd go through, I'd resolve the case. So now I'm going to go ahead and resolve my case. We'll just say that the problem has been solved. And then we'll hit resolve. So what will happen now in this situation is a workflow is going to run behind the scenes that ultimately is going to send an email out to the individualized person that was involved with this case. So Jim's going to get an email that's going to ask him to please click on the link to take our survey. Now this takes a couple of seconds to process through the email. We'll give it just a sec here to populate. But then once this goes through, if I go into my email, I will now get a follow-up on case option. And I'll see a link in here to complete the survey. So here's my please complete our post-case survey. Take a moment to complete our survey. I'll click on the link to complete our survey. And it says, okay, well, hello, Jim. So here's that pipe data. Please take a moment and complete our satisfaction survey. And now I'll just run through the survey. So I'll go into here. Then we will have our individualized information. How would you rate Derek's knowledge? How would you go through? We'll just answer a couple of these options. And we'll say, no, we're not interested. And next. That'll bypass all our product information. Tell us that, thank you for our input, and then kind of move on from there. Now, if for some reason I ever wanted to unsubscribe to these surveys or future surveys, you'll notice that down here on the bottom, there's my click here to unsubscribe to future surveys. I could click on that link, and then this would launch another survey that I could go through and process through that completion of those unsubscribe options. But this is a great way that if you want to personalize the survey experience that people are receiving, that you can do so just by simply defining what that information is and bringing it in from the application standpoint. As you start having people take these surveys and start going through and answering the questions, ultimately what's going to end up happening is responses are going to come back. And based upon how people have answered those questions, you want to be able to analyze the responses and the items and be able to consequently do stuff based upon those options. Well, from a voice of the customer perspective, there's two ways that you can handle dealing with completed surveys. You can do what are called responses, or you can do what is called feedback. And there are two very different ways to be able to handle the information in regards to what you want to report on and do stuff. So let's first talk about survey responses, because that's really the most common one that you're going to see. There is a table that exists in the Voice of the Customer solution called responses. And all it does is it stores all of the responses that have been brought back from the application as it goes out and pulls for responses from the cloud-based application. It will put every single survey response into that table, regardless of the survey that it came from. So it's one kind of a one-stop area for all of your different survey responses. Now, the nice thing about that is it gives you one simplistic area that you can work into, and you can kind of go through, and you can report individually on each one of those surveys based upon the items that are coming from the survey responses. You're really going to use survey responses for probably 80 to 90% of the surveys that you're going to be working with, because most of those surveys are going to be very limited shelf life. You might have a situation where you just did a trade show and now you want to do a quick little survey to see how everybody thought that went, how the presenters were, the food, all of those items. When you start talking about product testing, marketing, anything where that survey is not necessarily going to last for maybe more than a couple of days or even maybe a month or two. The other option that you have are what are called feedback. Now, what feedback does is instead of storing all of those responses in one table for every single survey, it actually creates a new custom entity inside Dynamics 365. And that entity is strictly used just for storing responses for that specific survey. Now, the reason why that's nice is because that now gives you the capabilities, because it's a custom entity in the application, to customize that entity the way that you would want to, if there's any specific information you want to grab, if there's any items you want to put in there, you have all of that information in there. Now, if you've done any customization of Dynamics 365 in the past, you know that creating custom entities isn't necessarily something that we want you to do for every item coming in. So feedback is definitely something that if you're going to use it, you want to look at your targeted situation for where feedback might come into play. Customer satisfaction surveys are a great way to be able to facilitate feedback, because that survey is probably not going to change much. Once you have that survey dialed in, that survey is going to get distributed out to everybody who goes through and completes a case, and that survey might run for years without ever being changed. That's a great example of where you would use feedback. You're going to create a custom entity specifically for storing that information and then working through. Now, from a survey perspective, it's all configurable based upon the survey. Out of the box, if you don't change anything, every survey is going to use survey responses. If you want to, you can go in and you can enable a survey for feedback to give you kind of that extra tier of information that you're going through. All of that, once you're going through and you enable it, then you have to basically go through, configure what you want to kind of call that information and set it up, and it will then start reporting that information back from a feedback standpoint. Now let's look at this just a little bit more in detail. So again, from a response standpoint, there's going to be an out-of-the-box entity that is going to store all of that information that will go across all the surveys in your deployment. So that'll have things like your survey score, that'll have your net promoter score, any related records that might be associated with that information are all going to be put into that information and all be stored basically as raw responses to the questions that'll be displayed inside web resources. Now it's extensible. If you wanted to, you could add custom fields, business process flows. There's a lot of out-of-the-box workflow activities that actually capture those responses inside those surveys so you can work with it. But again, probably the biggest thing that you want to look at is these are going to be used more for surveys with very limited shelf life or surveys that might be prone to have a lot of changes or updates, because you just want to put that raw information into a table where you can work with it. Feedback is going to be a situation where, like I said, customer service type situations where you have surveys that are not going to change very often. So what you would do from a feedback perspective then is a custom entity gets created, and then relationships can be defined for what specific entities you want this feedback entity to be associated with. So if this survey is primarily going to be associated with contacts and accounts, you can work with information from there. But it's a full-blown entity in the system. So you'll also have situation where forms will be created, charts will be created. So if you want to be able to, manipulate some of the information across that entity, you certainly can. Again, most of what you're going to probably be doing is going to be more response related, but feedback definitely gives you an option when you start working through it. Let's show you just a little bit on the process around the feedback enabling. Now again, you don't necessarily have to do feedback. More often than not, you're just going to work with the standard survey responses. But from a feedback perspective, you are creating a custom entity. So one of the requirements that has to be in place is a solution has to be created so you can store that entity. So if you don't have an unmanaged solution in the application, you typically won't be able to create this feedback entity inside there. So the first thing that you want to do if you're going to enable a survey for feedback is you're just going to want to go into solutions and define a new solution inside the system. So I'm just going to go in here and click on new. And we'll just call this VOC feedback. And from a publisher standpoint, I'll just use a demo publisher, give it my version number, and then I'll save and close. Because realistically, all I'm looking at here is that I have a container to store these customizations when this custom entity gets created. Next, I'm going to then go back into the application, and I'm going to go into Voice of the Customer, and I'm going to go into my surveys. And I'll open up kind of a sample Voice of the Customer survey that we've created earlier. Now, if I scroll down into here, I will see underneath my invitations and actions, I will see a feedback option. And so there's a couple of different ways that I can do this. I can kind of trigger when I want feedback to be generated, so I can kind of manually generate that information when I'm going through. So I can go into here and generate the survey feedback manually. Or I also have the option to just have the feedback entity get created automatically once the survey is published. So depending upon what my specific needs are, I can actually have it go through and do it for me. We'll give it just a second here. So from a manual standpoint, I have the option to kind of define when that takes place, but also from an automatic standpoint, usually I can just have it take place once the survey has actually been published. Now, again, we'll give this just a sec to catch up, and then we'll go ahead and switch this to kind of automatic feedback so you can see what that process looks like. So we'll give this 1 sec here. Let's just pop that up one more time. So now when I come down into my feedback customizations, you can see there's a whole other gamut of information that I can work with. So what is going to be the name of the feedback? So again, this is really just creating a custom entity in the application. So this is going to be called, sample CS survey. So in this case, that's fine. That's going to be the entity name. Do I want it to create any relationships for me? So are there going to be any relationships that I want to define with this? So do I want to relate this to a contact? Well, yes, I probably do, because contacts will more than likely be taking this survey. Do I want to relate this to the account entity? Additional relationships can always be created manually, but these will be out of the box at the time when it's working through that situation. So in this case, we can go ahead and kind of work through these items and define what the option is that we want to work from. Do I want it to create the form for this particular entity? Do I want it to create charts and dashboards? Is there a key question that we're going to use for kind of measuring analytics with inside the survey? At this point, I can set any one of these individual options, and then I can also come in here and determine what solution I want to create that in. So now you'll see that from a schema name, it looks at the solution that I've selected, and then it goes out and it creates the schema name automatically for me. Now, the other thing that I could do is, if this survey is regarding a case or something like that, this is where I could actually go in and I could define what specific entity I wanted to associate this with as well if I wanted additional reporting capability. capabilities. But ultimately, once this is published, then the feedback entity for this particular survey will get generated, and then as it goes out and pulls for responses, that information will pull in from there. Again, this is just a great way that if you want to have a little bit more control over how you're analyzing that information, that you can do so in here with very little effort whatsoever. We talked about this a little bit initially when we were first talking about surveys, but from time to time, as people are taking these surveys, each one of those survey questions, as we saw, could have the ability to have a rating associated with it, where you can assign a numeric value to that question based upon how they answer that. So if you've got 5 smiley faces and they answer 5 smiley faces, they could get a number from 1 to 5 or from 1 to 10 based upon those options coming in. And the more people answer those types of questions, the more a composite survey score is going to be defined for those individual scenarios. Well, you may want to be alerted of a potential issue if somebody taking that survey has a composite score of less than a certain denomination, basically, that you've defined within that survey. And that can be done through an alert task. So if you look at the survey underneath invitations and actions, there's an option here to create an alert task. And so what this is going to do is say, if the survey falls below a certain score, what do we want to do? And so this is where I can define what that measurement option is. So do I want to calculate the survey score based upon how people are answering questions? I can say yes. And so it'll look at all the different questions that they are answering, and it will compile a composite score. So this is where you have to understand what those scoring numeric options are around the items that you've worked with. But here's where I can define, okay, if the score is less than 25, because maybe I'm using a 100-point scale for the survey itself, I want to go ahead and trigger an alert task. And in this case, I want to send that alert task to somebody within the organization. And so this is where I can define how I want to send that information in there. So this is where I can actually go through and pick what type of email situation I want to use to respond back to that. But ultimately, it's just going to create an item in the system that's going to notify us that somebody scored below a certain threshold. So now I could go out and I could take some type of action on that and then move forward from there. You have a lot of different ways to handle how you want to distribute surveys. And ultimately, that's the main goal, is once we've got the survey created, we want to get it out to people so they can start working through it. The big things that you want to remember when you start distributing surveys is the survey has to be published before you can distribute it out and have it be taken by your respondents. So you have to go out and physically publish that survey first. Once you have that survey published, then it's going to create both the non-anonymous and the anonymous links available. The anonymous link is going to be really just a hyperlink inside the application that you can use for working through and working through that option. The non-anonymous one is going to be that email snippet, and that's that one that you can paste into an email, and once you paste it into an email, it'll change once that item physically gets distributed out as part of the application itself. Now, if you're looking to further customize how somebody will interact with that survey, that's where that pipe data option comes into play. You can go into the survey snippet that's going to be distributed out to the people taking the survey, and you can add things like name value pairs for the customer, for the user, for the product, for the service, any one of those 8 fields that we talked a little bit about the pipe data option, and actually have that dynamically populate. Now, those can be static values that you can just hard code into the actual email snippet, or those could be dynamic values that could be populated from CRM records that initiate that. But either way, that gives you multiple options for being able to go out and define how you want to distribute that survey moving forward.